You've been a child therapist.
Yeah.
For how long?
For 18 years.
Uh-huh. And you stopped, why?
For two reasons. The main one was that I had my own children. Before I had my own children, I could listen to anything. And it was part of my own sort of hero myth, I think, of myself as a therapist, that I could bear anything.
But was that true? You could bear anything?
I could bear everything that I heard. And I heard some terrible things, obviously, as anybody would who did the job.
Where did you work?
I worked in child guidance clinics and children's homes and what were then called schools for maladjusted children. And those were places where they just put all the children they didn't know what to do with. The children that weren't in prison or hospital, basically. So there were a lot of rough kids, and a lot of kids from very poor backgrounds. So that I heard a lot of very disturbing things. When I had my own children, it was a bit like every child was my child. I don't mean this in some grandiose, sentimental way, but basically it felt more like that. And it was as though I could still listen to anything, but I sort of didn't want to. I found myself much more disturbed by it. That was one bit. The other bit was that the National Health Service I worked for began to fall apart, in the sense that when I started as a child psychotherapist, I could see children for as long as it took.
And what does that mean for as
and
long as it took?
That could be literally 2 weeks or 3 years. Because that psychotherapy depends upon time. It's about time. By the time I left, they, i.e. the government and various managers, were saying, well, we'll pay for 6 sessions and it's got to work.
Yeah.
In other words, the criteria for cure were really business criteria and nothing to do with what I took to be mental health criteria. So we were managed by people who didn't understand what we were doing, and we were given much less money. So it became impossible.
Yeah.
It became a business, whereas once it had become an idealist, it was once an idealistic enterprise. Anybody could have child psychotherapy on the health service.
But what's the idea? 10 sessions? That's no idea at all.
It's pointless. It's absolutely pointless. But it's of a piece with a certain kind of model of medical economics, which is you have to have outcomes that are recordable and then turned into statistics to prove that these forms of treatment work. But actually, it isn't like that. It's the wrong story.
These days you work as a psychoanalyst. How many people you see during a day?
I see between 8 and 10.
And for how long you talk with them?
Between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. It varies. It's mostly 45 minutes.
4 days a week?
I do it 4 days a week. They don't all come 4 days a week.
No. Okay.
They come once or twice a week.
What's the difference between children and adults?
Well, adults are much more defended. I mean, the great thing about seeing children is that it's more fun because they're funnier. You can say anything to children.
Why is that?
Why is what?
Why are they funnier?
Because they vary, obviously, but nevertheless, more children are better at getting pleasure than adults. That is to say, they want to have a good time. They really want to. And so they're amusing. And I don't mean to laugh at, but to laugh with.
Yeah.
They are genuinely, a lot of children are genuinely funny, given a chance to be. Because it's one of the currencies between them and adults. Also, you can say anything to children, because if they're not interested, it doesn't matter, and if they are, they're really engaged.
Yeah.
Whereas with adults, adults are much more defensive. And of course, there's much more of a demand. If I say something to you, you've got to sort of engage with it. Whereas children can be much more ruthless sometimes.
Yeah.
You know what it's like. You're talking to a child or reading a child a story, and he'll go off and do something else.
Yeah.
Children drop adults all the time.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful and freeing. Whereas adults are, broadly speaking, more polite.
And adults are more afraid, I think.
And much more afraid, yeah. But they also know much more what there is to be afraid of.
Question about your work. You once said that therapy is more about sentences than about theories. Can you explain that?
Yes, I think that the trouble with theories is they're often too grandiose in their reach. They're an attempt to make too large a generalization. Whereas the thing about in psychology, none of the generalizations are true. You have to start from that premise, because people are very individual as well as very communal. I think that a sentence is a better unit, because it's shorter and because it's potentially more condensed. It's a bit like the difference between a poem and a paragraph of prose. And I think that I'm more interested, and this is partly for aesthetic reasons probably, but I'm more interested in, well, on the one hand, I'm more interested in reading as reading sentences. So I'm reading for the sentences, not for the story. And when I listen to people, I seem to listen for the sentences.
Not for the story.
Not as much for the story, no, although I also listen for the story.
But they always say that therapy is about storytelling.
It is, but the risk is that stories can be very defensive. You know, if I can tell you a very coherent, absorbing story...
Can you give an example of that?
Well, I could tell you a story about my life, which would be a coherent narrative, let's say, of me from the age of 5 to, let's say, 15. But in the very attempt to make it coherent, I will have excluded a lot of anomalous, difficult, tricky things. So there's something about narrative coherence that is itself very self-protective. Whereas if I just chat on, I might say something that and I might surprise myself.
Yeah, storytelling is about leaving out. That's what
it's very much about leaving out. And so in a way, what the analyst does is make suggestions about what might be left out.
Okay, I get that. Can you tell the story about the father of Thomas Mann?
Yeah.
What did he do?
The father of Thomas Mann took his children to a patisserie and said to them, you can eat as many cakes as you want. And all the children, of course, were very gleeful, thought, great. And what they discovered was that actually they didn't want to eat that many cakes because beyond a certain point they felt sick. And this was Thomas Mann's father's rather devious, manipulative and slightly fascistic way.
Is it fascistic?
I think it is, actually.
Why is it fascistic?
I think it's fascistic because he already knows the answer. It's not an experiment. So it's a seduction.
Yeah.
It's a bit like you promise the children 100 cakes and the children discover they're only going to eat 2.
Yeah.
As if to say, there you are. Father knows best.
Yeah.
Now, that's a shame, I think. It would have been much more interesting if he'd said to his children, let's say, once a year, we'll go to this cafe and you could eat as many cakes as you want.
Yeah.
And that's free. And then you can find out how many cakes you want. But I think this was an attempt to prove to them that actually greed doesn't work and isn't good.
What is greed?
Greed is wanting more than you can have.
Yeah.
And greed is also, it's a self-cure for a state of deprivation. So that if I'm feeling deprived of something, I'm very likely to want too much of it. And that's the problem with greed.
It's also about, I think, not making to one choices.
Yes, exactly. It's also about narrowing choice or preempting choice. So that instead of thinking, okay, what on this menu do I want? You think I'll have 10 steaks, and that solves the problem. And it's a bit like hypnotizing yourself. And I think what that does is it takes the drama out of making choices.
How dangerous is an excess?
Well, it depends what kind, because there are areas in one's life where excess is valuable and interesting, and there are areas in one's life where it's very debilitating, I think. And in a way, you could think growing up is the process of finding out for oneself which those areas are. There are some things or people I want a lot of, and some things and people I might need to have less of. But it's about the quality of the experience, not the amount.
When does it become dangerous?
It becomes dangerous when it becomes self-destructive. If I love chocolate and I eat too much chocolate, I will kill my pleasure in chocolate. It seems to me the project is sustaining one's pleasure. And the risk is that unconsciously greed is the attempt to destroy one's pleasure.
A big question, but you can handle it. Do we live in an age, the 21st century, of excess?
Yeah, we do. And I think we live in an age of disparate excesses. In other words, there are a huge number of people who are excessively poor, and there is a smaller, large number of people who are excessively rich. So I think that that's the most fundamentally obvious picture of this thing, which is, it's very, very strange, it seems to me, that lots of middle-class people in the West really think a lot about what they're going to eat. They go to restaurants. Whereas, as everybody knows, it's not a secret, in a way that makes it more interesting. There are lots of people for whom survival is literally the project, in a very fundamental sense. There's no excess. It's just a question of whether you can have enough to survive, and a very limited amount. Yeah. Also, everybody knows who makes a profit. They can only make a profit if somebody else's labour has been exploited. It's not a mystery, this. It's absolutely clear. What's shocking is that those excesses are entirely acceptable.
Entirely.
Well, no one's really screaming and shouting. No one is really saying, I think, here is a legitimate, plausible alternative to capitalism,
No.
or to profit.
Uh-huh.
You know, because one thing that communism did, whether or not we're communists now, communists said politics is not only a matter of economics. Whereas now, the point is, politics is entirely about economics, and the only political agenda is, how do you tax rich people less?
How come? How have you come so far?
I don't know the answer to that, like everybody else. But I do know that everybody has underestimated the resilience and the power of capitalism.
And at the same time, our behavior has become more excessive too.
It has, but also, one thing that capitalism, I think, does very successfully is exploit something about appetite. And I think that capitalism is for children, because it engages with appetite at the child's level.
Capitalism is for children.
Capitalism for children in the sense that children always want the next best thing.
Yeah.
Because they're just beginning to deal with the conflicts about appetite. So, go to a supermarket. Have more.
Yeah.
It's like the thing you were saying earlier about choices and having a sense of what is enough.
Yeah.
In the book, I quote what I think is a brilliant comment by Neil Diamond. Someone says to Neil Diamond, what do you think about being rich? He says, you can't have 2 lunches.
That's it.
That's a great point. You can't have 2 lunches.
Yeah.
But what if you want to start trying to have 2 lunches? Or you have one very, very, very long lunch?
Yeah.
Why are you doing that?
Let's talk about stimuli. You're not on the internet.
No.
You don't have email?
No.
Do you Google?
No.
Why not?
Because I want less communication, not more. I want to communicate as much as possible with people I know. I don't want to find out things about people that they don't know I'm finding out. In terms of people I know, I don't mean people who are dead. So that I want, in a way, insofar as I can, to exempt myself from all those forms of information and access.
30 years ago, I didn't have a cell phone. There was no internet. I even had a landline. And I didn't have the idea that I was missing something. I have these days. Why is that?
Because if you have access to somebody or something, you can feel excluded by them.
It's as simple as that.
Well, no, it's not as simple as that. because that has very powerful consequences. Because it means that if the internet goes down, you feel radically deprived of something you begin to feel that you need. Because it's as though suddenly you don't know what's going on. And it's very like, you know, the experience of any form of familiarization. You know, if you have a relationship with your mother or father and they go away, you feel it. And you wonder what's going on when you don't have access. And it has powerful echoes, I think, in one's history. It's like being cut off or abandoned or unmoored.
It has to do with that, you think?
I think it's linked to that, yeah. Because I think the internet gives people the illusion of continual contact.
Yeah.
So that when it's gone or when it's down, it's as though there's a reminder of what it's like to be abandoned or separated from all these people that one was in instant communication with.
And what can I do about that feeling?
I think you should live with it.
Yeah, live with it. But how?
Well, you see, I think in a way you should have this both ways, which is there's the pleasure of the internet and the access it brings, but there's a different kind of pleasure when it goes down, because instead of thinking, oh my God, it's gone, you could be thinking, what shall I do now in its absence?
Yeah.
In other words, that's an opportunity. The risk is it becomes an addiction, so you're not thinking, great, I can read a book now.
Yeah.
You're thinking, how can I get the internet back?
Yeah.
So it becomes like an addiction. Everything is organized around sustaining it and locating it and keeping in touch with it.
Are we talking about excessive behavior here?
We could be, yeah.
Why do you say we could be?
Well, because it may be essential to how you work. You know, it would be absurd to generalize here. But if you're beginning to feel, why am I so obsessed by the internet? I would want to say to you, well, it's a good question. Because actually, it could be quite freeing to lose the internet occasionally.
Yeah.
You could actually, it could create the space to do something else.